He had everything a man could possibly want: a crown, a kingdom, a royal family, and a future that had already been decided for him. Edward was born to become King of Britain. From childhood, he was prepared for a life of duty. He was taught how to behave, how to speak, how to represent the crown, and most importantly, how to put the monarchy before himself. But Edward was different. He loved freedom. He enjoyed meeting ordinary people. He traveled widely, and he often questioned the rigid rules of royal life. The public loved him. He was young, handsome, modern, and completely different from the older generation of royalty. For many people, Edward looked like the future of the British monarchy. Then, he met a woman who would change everything. Her name was Wallis Simpson. She was intelligent, confident, and completely outside the traditional world of British royalty. But there was one enormous problem. Wallis was an American, and she was already married. Edward knew that a relationship with her could create a scandal, but he continued seeing her. The relationship became serious, and eventually, Edward realized something that would place him directly against the institution he was born to lead. He wanted to marry her, but Britain had a constitutional problem. The king was not simply a private man. His personal decisions could affect the entire country, and Wallis was a divorced woman. The idea of the king marrying her was unacceptable to many people around him. Government ministers opposed the marriage. The church opposed it, and members of the royal family were deeply uncomfortable. Edward was given a choice: give up Wallis, or give up the crown. For most people, the answer would have been obvious. But Edward had spent his entire life being told that he would become king. Now, for the first time, he had to decide what mattered more: the crown, or the woman he loved. And in December 1936, Edward VIII made one of the most extraordinary decisions in British royal history. He chose love, and by choosing Wallis Simpson, he gave up the throne. Edward VIII had been king for less than a year, but already, his private life had become a national crisis. He wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, but the British government refused to accept the marriage. The problem was not simply that Wallis was American. She was also divorced, and at the time, the king was closely connected to the Church of England. A marriage to a divorced woman was considered deeply controversial. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin told Edward that the government could not support the marriage. Edward refused to abandon Wallis. Several alternatives were discussed, but none could solve the problem. Edward understood that he was running out of choices. If he insisted on marrying Wallis, he could create a constitutional crisis. And if he gave up Wallis, he would be giving up the person he loved. The pressure became enormous. Newspapers were watching. Politicians were watching. The royal family was watching. And the public was waiting to discover what their king would do. Then, Edward made his decision. On December 10, 1936, he signed the instrument of abdication. He was giving up the crown. The following day, he addressed the nation by radio. He explained that he could not carry out his duties as king without the woman he loved beside him. His reign had lasted only 326 days, one of the shortest reigns in British history. His younger brother Albert became king. He took the name George VI. And suddenly, Edward was no longer king. He was the Duke of Windsor. The crown he had been prepared for his entire life was now on his brother's head. For Edward, the decision was final. But it came with a price. He had lost his position, his constitutional role, and his place at the center of British public life. His brother, who had never expected to become king, was now responsible for a country facing an increasingly dangerous Europe. The royal family was forced to adapt. George VI had to overcome his own insecurities and take on a role he had never wanted. Edward and Wallis eventually married in France. But the wedding was not attended by members of the British royal family. The man who had once been the future of the monarchy was now living far away from the throne. He had chosen love. But the question remained: had he truly won? Or had he sacrificed far more than he realized? Because Edward's story was not simply about giving up a crown. It was about what happened after the crown was gone. Edward had given up the crown. But giving up the throne did not mean giving up the past. He and Wallis Simpson married in France in 1937. The wedding was private. There were no grand British royal celebrations, no official royal ceremony, and most importantly, no members of Edward's immediate family attended. The couple began a new life together. Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor, but he was no longer king. He and Wallis lived a wealthy and glamorous life. They traveled across Europe, attended parties, met famous people, and became a constant subject of public fascination. From the outside, it looked like Edward had won. He had chosen love. He had escaped the restrictions of the crown. And he was finally free. But freedom came with an unexpected loneliness. Edward was no longer part of the central royal family. His brother George VI was now king, and the relationship between the two brothers became complicated. George had inherited a role he had never expected. He had to carry the enormous responsibility of being king during one of the most dangerous periods in British history. Edward, meanwhile, was living away from Britain. And then, Europe moved toward war. In 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. The world changed again. Edward wanted a role. He wanted to serve. But his relationship with the British government and the royal family was complicated. He was eventually sent to the Bahamas, where he served as governor. The glamorous Duke of Windsor now had an official position, but he was thousands of miles away from Britain, and far from the royal family. Meanwhile, his brother George VI remained in Britain. During the Blitz, the King and Queen stayed in London. They visited bombed neighborhoods. They met civilians. And they became symbols of national resilience. The contrast between the two brothers became impossible to ignore. George had accepted a burden he never wanted. Edward had rejected the burden he had been born to carry. And history began to judge them very differently. Edward and Wallis continued their life together. They lived in beautiful homes, traveled extensively, and remained famous. But Edward never became king again. The crown was gone forever. And so was the possibility of returning to the role he had been prepared for since childhood. Years passed. The world changed. The British Empire changed. And the monarchy changed with it. Edward eventually became an increasingly distant figure from the center of British royal life. But one thing remained constant: his relationship with Wallis. They stayed together for decades. Through wealth, exile, controversy, and old age. To the public, their story remained romantic. A king who gave up his crown for love. But behind the romantic story, there was another question. What did Wallis actually think about the sacrifice? And what did Edward feel when he watched his brother carry the crown he had abandoned? Because sometimes, the hardest part of giving something up is not the moment you lose it. It is the years afterward, when you realize you can never have it back. When Edward gave up the crown, his younger brother Albert had no choice but to become king. He had never expected to rule Britain. He was shy, quiet, and uncomfortable speaking in public. But now, the weight of the monarchy was on his shoulders. He chose the name George VI, and his first challenge was enormous. He had to convince the British people that the monarchy could survive the crisis Edward had left behind. George had struggled with a severe stammer since childhood. Speaking publicly had always been difficult for him. But now, he had to address an entire nation. And then, the Second World War began. Britain faced one of the darkest periods in its history. German bombs destroyed parts of London. Families were forced into shelters. Buildings disappeared overnight. And millions of people feared what would happen next. George and his wife Elizabeth chose to remain in Britain. They refused to leave London during the Blitz. The king visited bombed neighborhoods. He met soldiers. He visited hospitals. And he stood beside ordinary citizens during some of the country's darkest days. Slowly, the image of the monarchy changed. George was no longer simply the shy younger brother who had unexpectedly inherited the crown. He became a symbol of courage, duty, and national unity. And somewhere far away, Edward watched. The contrast between the brothers became increasingly powerful. Edward had been the popular prince, the modern king, the man people admired. But he had left the throne. George had never wanted the crown. Yet he stayed. He accepted the responsibility. And he carried it through war. For Edward, this must have been complicated. He had chosen a different life. He had chosen Wallis. He had chosen freedom. But the crown had continued without him. And his brother had made it work. George VI eventually became deeply respected. Not because he had wanted to be king, but because he accepted the duty when his country needed him. And that changed the meaning of Edward's decision. Edward had always believed that giving up the throne was a personal choice. But the monarchy was never simply personal. His decision had consequences for his entire family. His brother inherited a burden he had never expected. His nieces grew up under the shadow of the crown. And the future of the British monarchy changed forever. One of those nieces was Princess Elizabeth. She was still a young girl. But history was already moving toward her. Because when George VI became king, he had unknowingly placed his daughter on the path toward becoming queen. And years later, Elizabeth would inherit the crown. The same crown Edward had once been expected to wear. Edward had given it up for love. His brother had carried it through war. And now, a new generation was waiting to inherit it. But Edward's story still had one final chapter. Because decades later, the former king would return to Britain. And come face to face with the family. And the crown he had left behind. Edward VIII never became king again. But the crown remained part of his life. For decades, he and Wallis lived away from Britain. They traveled, attended social events, and built a life of their own. But Edward remained a member of the royal family. And as the years passed, the distance between him and Britain slowly changed. His brother George VI died in 1952. And Edward's niece, Princess Elizabeth, became Queen Elizabeth II. The crown that Edward had once abandoned was now on the head of the young woman who had grown up knowing him as her uncle. Edward watched the new queen begin her reign. But he remained outside the center of royal life. He and Wallis continued living mostly in France. Their relationship lasted for decades. They became one of the most famous couples of the 20th century. To the public, their story was simple. A king gave up his crown for the woman he loved. But history is rarely that simple. Edward had chosen love. But his decision had changed the lives of everyone around him. His brother became king unexpectedly. His family had to deal with the consequences. And Britain entered a new era under George VI. Later, Elizabeth II became one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history. Edward, the man who had once been destined to become king, was now watching history from the outside. He occasionally returned to Britain, especially for important family occasions. But he never reclaimed the role he had abandoned. The crown belonged to another generation. And eventually, time caught up with him. Edward died in France in 1972. He was buried at Frogmore, near Windsor. Wallis lived for many more years. When she died, she was buried beside Edward. For all the controversy, all the political pressure, and all the years of separation, they remained together until the end. And that is what makes Edward's story so fascinating. Was he selfish? Was he brave? Was he a romantic? Or was he simply a man who refused to live a life chosen for him? There is no easy answer. He was born to become king. He was prepared for the crown. He became king. And then, he gave it away. His decision changed the British monarchy forever. It brought George VI to the throne. It shaped the childhood of Elizabeth II. And ultimately, it changed the line of succession. Edward lost the crown, but he gained the freedom he believed he wanted. The question is, whether the price was worth it. Because there are some choices in life that can never be undone. Edward VIII made one of them. He chose love over duty, and the crown he surrendered would never be his again. If you enjoyed this royal history story, like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel Sleepless Historian, and watch more emotional stories of kings, queens, and the people who changed history. Because sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is the one who walks away from the crown.